story while we wait. The ninth, they have a big yontif, you know. So the president Belzer Rebbe was in Bnei Brak, he was visiting his brother-in-law, the Visions Rebbe. So he asked him, why is it that Belz, his father, the president Belzer Rebbe, came to the border of Eretz Yisrael, they escaped from the Holocaust, there's a big simcha, right? A big tish, and he said in Vishnitz, when the Imre Chaim, the president of Visions Rebbe's grandfather, escaped, and he had Nisim V'neflois, he was in a camp, a work camp, and he crossed the border in a cornfield on his belly, and the bullets were whizzing all sides. And he Nisim V'neflois. Imre Chaim once told the Chazan, if I wouldn't have subsequently sinned, I would have been today a tzaddik. Because the tshuva that he did, that period, you know, under a hail of fire, right, was whatever. So he said, how come in Visions they don't celebrate the Hatzalah of the Visions Rebbe, the Rebbe? The president of Visions Rebbe said a Meir Digavor. He says, you can't compare the two. The Belzer Rebbe lost his entire family in the Holocaust. He had a son, a big tzaddik called Moshe, and when he was killed by the Yamach Shemayim, by the Nazis, his only response was, "Chaz the chesed from Bashefa as ich got achelik in the karbonos of Kol Yisrael." Wow. It's a chesed, it's a kindness of the Eibishtai. Also had a portion in the karbonos of Kol Yisrael. Never said kaddish for him, never said yizkur, nothing. He just didn't want to be in any way different than everyone else. He just, whatever, he lost his entire family. So he, except his brother.
Why not say kaddish?
And whatever. And probably didn't need the kaddish, you know, whatever. Right? Anyway, to cut a long story short, when he came to Eretz Yisrael, he was able to sit with the Udim Musalim Eish, the survivors, the Brachad Eden, broken hearts, who also lost their family. At least they could celebrate that something survived, there was a remnant, and we could rebuild an empire of Torah cities. The Visions Rebbe, my Zayda, he escaped with every one of his family members in a different way. All of his children managed to escape. And all of his brothers managed to survive. How could he sit with the Chassidim to celebrate his own personal Hatzalah, right? To sit there with broken Yid. It's an incredible, the hair of sensitivity towards the sorrows of the Yid. There's a word from Yitzhak Vurka, who was a great Rebbe, who was my wife's great-great-great-great-grandfather, somewhere down the line. And he said that the Gemara says that in Tainis, the Talmidim asked Reb Zeira b'meha lachta yomim. In what schus did you live? You blessed with longevity. You lived a long time. And one of the qualities that he mentioned, me'olam lisasti b'takalus chaveri. I never rejoice in the downfall of my friends. Right? That's not a great mila. I mean, like if you would be sus b'takalus chaveri, you're a Hitler. You're a Machshama. Yeah, it's not a great mila not to. He said, Pshat, the Vurka Rebbe said, Pshat is, right? When I had a personal simcha, legitimate simcha, my daughter's getting married, my son's getting married, whatever, I couldn't rejoice completely because of the Kol Chaver. That's the madreg. Right? That's what Tzaddikim had as a by Sarah. It says that when she gave birth at age 90, miraculously, right? So all the Akaras were nifkud with her. Why is that? So it's not the same words. Because if she would have had a child and our friends didn't, she wouldn't be able to rejoice in her personal something. Right? Tzaddikim took to heart the tzaras of Klal Yisrael, and they as if it's a personal issue. That's what the Vurka Rebbe said. But Meisher Ben says, "Yifked Hashem l'kei aruchis ish lo eidah sheyetzil them." To be a manig Yisrael, to be a leader of Klal Yisrael, you have to have someone that sheyetzil them with oiskein farid. Someone who's willing to die for Jews. Someone who's willing to give himself over for Jews. That's the madreg of a manig Yisrael. That's what it means to be a responsible Jewish leader. By the Vurka Rebbe, there's a famous story that when he passed away, his sons thought that maybe he'd come to him in a dream, and some kind of vision, some kind of whatever, and tell him what's the afterlife, what's happening, and no communication. So they went to their father's best friend, who was the Reb Menachem Mendel of Kotz. Right? And he said, they told him there, and what's bothering them, that the father made no contact after he departed from the world. And the Kotz Rebbe was also wondering, right? So if you can't bring Muhammad to the mountain, you bring the mountain to Muhammad, right? So I decided to make an Aliyah on the Shabbat, and I went to Gan Eden. Everywhere I went, they told me he was here, but he's left. And finally, on the outskirts of Gan Eden, there was like an ocean, like a lake, or a river, whatever. And I saw Rebbe Yitzchak sitting there on a cane, sitting with eyes closed in deep meditation. And I asked Shallechem, Rebbe Yitzchak, what are you doing here? He said, after he passed away, they went to Bet Shalmaila, they judged him, Gan Eden, straight, right? And they gave him the royal tour, the VIP tour of the place. Anyway, this Heichel, that Heichel, this Mezivta, that Mezivta. And they took him to this ocean, this lake. So what is this? This is an ocean of Jewish tears. When I said the person has a legitimate tear, HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved from, right? God counts them and he puts it in his celestial treasure house, right? So Yitzchak swore, I'm not moving from this place until the Eivishter will fulfill his promise of erasing all tears. And even in Gan Eden, he wasn't willing to sit there and enjoy the good life, So what am I here? He's here, Rabbi Zosowski. It's Farbrengen. I'm going here for 20 minutes.
I came here to hear you. I got here late, so I'm going to hear for 10 minutes.
Right, I'm just saying. I'll say a word about Yud Shvat. I said this morning. I just came to mind while I was the end of my speech. And I figured out. I said a word, but I just always remember for a Mendel Futtervat. You ask any of the older Chassidim who were alive, Yud Shvat, Tovshin Yud, right, 71 years ago, where were you, Yud Shvat? And everyone will tell you a different answer. Remember, the Futtervas was in my mashpia. I learned with him privately every day. And he was in a gulag. In a camp, a labor camp, in Siberia somewhere in Alashnotzir. And Punkt Yud Shvat, they called him into interrogation. Right? They were interrogating him, and the interrogations were brutal. You can imagine these beatings and all kinds of. They wanted him to open up. Who's part of the Chassidic underground? Who's being made for. And despite everything, he would never divulge. Anyway, Yud Shvat, he got another beating, and didn't. Right? And they say, Mendel, the war's over. The Rebbe passed away. Right? The Frierdiker Rebbe was considered to be like public enemy number one. Mendel had a brother actually called Handel Lieberman. He went a different surname. And in the Second World War, he was a general. He was like a top in the army. And he went, because of his whatever, he was able to go to places that other people couldn't go. He was a famous artist, actually, a very renowned artist. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he went into this room in like military, whatever, headquarters, whatever, and there were 3 pictures hanging on the wall, right? And he's studying them because they were like obviously from the great artists of Russia, right? One of them was Trotsky, one of them was Bulgarin, and one of them was a previous Rebbe. And they said this is the 3 biggest enemies of the Soviet Union. We're talking this after the previous Rebbe left Russia.
This is Handel?
The communists, old Handel. You know what? These are the 3 great enemies of the Soviet Union, Communist Party. They understood that was right? So they, anyway, in getting back in this gulag, in this interrogation, they say, Mendel, the game's over. Lubavitch is finished. It's all over, right? The Rebbe passed away, right? And he left only 2 sons, only sons-in-law. One of them is fatant, one of them is thick, not the... Right? And the other one's very modern. So none of them fit the role of being a Rebbe, to be a successor. And therefore, Lubavitch is headless, leaderless, right? And therefore, what are you fighting for? What are you being so obstinate and stubborn and whatever? The game's over. It's all, Lubavitch is finished. So you might as well change parties, right? And Mendel said they did that shtick of telling them that the Rebbe died, they said many times. But he suddenly felt this is true. You'll ask me, how did he know? He's not a Rebbe, he's not a Baal Ruach HaKodesh, right? But obviously the pshat is that a chassid who's attached to a Rebbe very deeply and passionately, so, like a Rebbe knows a chassid. I always tell the story. Remember me to come back to the Mendel story. My wife's grandfather, all I knew his name was Yoel Lifshitz. And really, Minamoker, he was a Gerachos. His father was very close to his grandfather, all big Gerachos. His father was a Shemeir, and they're all Gerachos. Anyway, he was a Shoichet, right? And in the 1930s, right, he was a Shoichet, he was in Paris. right, in Paris. And suddenly he gets a telegram from Farbrengen, the Rebbe's secretary, right, that the previous Rebbe was unwell. He was physically like whatever, and he's coming to Paris to visit one of the professors, one of the big doctors here, right? And he asked my wife's grandfather, whom I knew, would he come and pick the previous Rebbe up from the train station, right? He's coming from Poland, whatever. Pick him up, bring him to the doctor, wait for him, bring him back to the train station, and he's getting a train out of there, right? But please, it's incognito. It's like please don't share any of this information with any other Hasidim, Lubavitchers especially. They'll all come, man. It's under the radar. It's like he's coming in to visit the doctor, but he doesn't want a whole tumult without pursuit, without publicity. Yeah. So okay, fine. He's easy, you know. He went. He picked up the previous Rebbe, right? He brought him to the doctor, waited for him, brought him back, and the whole time by Polish Hasidim, there's a custom. You mask yourself. You say your name. The Rebbe. You mask yourself. You say your name to the Rebbe like Yoel ben Chaya Genendel, right? And the Rebbe should remember me if you. Okay. So Yoel ben Chaya Genendel is exactly the grand total of 4 words. Hello? Probably one of gazillions of people over whatever. End of the story. That's all. End of the story. There's not a whole story behind this, but right? He then, the Friedrich Rebbe escaped to America in 1940, right? He escaped. He got on the last boat. They wouldn't let him into America. He ended up in Cuba. My mother-in-law says she spoke Spanish before she spoke English. In Cuba in the war. After the war, America, Nimku Rachmov, and the Sheikhs of Plata, people, whatever, how many people, how many boats went back to Europe, etc., couldn't get in, quotas. After the war, they got a bit of Rachmanis, they let people into America. They came to America, they were living in New York at the time. Actually, my son is now living in the same street that my wife's grandfather lived in like 100 years before, you know, whatever. Fenimore Street, like Fenimore Street is right, like the border of Crown Heights, like Crown Heights and East Flatbush. There's a lot of Lubavitchers that moved further down because real estate is very expensive. And a few blocks down, a few blocks off Empire, like 3-4 blocks, whatever. Santo, you know, you go back to, well, anyway, to cut a long story short, right?
Yeah.
Yale was living there. Yale just moved to Kingston, Pennsylvania. My daughter, Menucha Rochel, lived in that. Remember that same block, if you don't, you know. Just had a Schwarzer just banged into her, was driving a car, stole a car, was worth $90,000, just 2 days ago. He stole a car. I don't know what he was smoking or ingesting or drinking or whatever. But he stole someone's car, like his fancy sports car, $90,000 car, right? And he banged into 2 cars on either side of the street, and then he banged into her house, a fence, like, well, they came, 40 people, Schwarzers came, and they just wiped everything down and just took away the evidence, the fingerprints, etc., and the police came a half hour later. Nothing they're going to do, because if you even arrest a guy, he gets out of jail within a day. They didn't even bother pursuing it. Whatever, that's street. Anyway, Nachfel Yanenu, right? So my wife's grandfather was a sheikh, right? That's what he did for a living. And New York was very difficult. In those days, he was offered a job to be the sheikh in Charleston, South Carolina. We're talking like 1948, 47, 48, those years, right? Problem was, he was a Gera Chassid, and the Rebbe, the Gera Rebbe, was never just in the middle of a war. He passed away, Shvu was tough right? And there's no way he could contact the Gera Rebbe. But you don't take such a decision to move an entire young mishpacha to Charleston, in the middle of nowhere, in Dixieland, you know, in the Confederacy, without asking advice of it. So you can't get into the, you can't get to the Gera Rebbe, you can't make contact even. But go to Lubavitcher Rebbe, somebody, you don't take 15 on your own plates. So he went into Lubavitch in 770. And the previous Rebbe wasn't well in those years. So he went into Rabbi Simpson. He could go into the Rebbe. The Rebbe said he's not taking anybody in. That day he wasn't well, but he's not taking anyone today. No one go in. But he's a Gera. You ever see the Geras? Are all like, 6'4", 300 pound, Green Bay Packer linebackers. They're all like very tiefen. They don't take no. Gera Chevra don't take no for an answer. They're starker Chevra, right? And he's arguing like a Gerach Chassid would. And they're simming up, back and forth, up and down. And he's not winning, so he leaves. He leaves in a huff. Right? He's like halfway down Eastern Parkway, and suddenly Rabbi Simpson's running after him. He says, the Rebbe remembers your voice from Paris. He owes you a favor. He said, I should let you in. Now, what's pshat in this? I always say pshat in the story. If you would tell me, okay, the Friedrich Rebbe Ruach HaKodesh, okay, so the Rebbes, that's what they do for a living, you know. If you tell me the Rebbe had a photographic memory, okay, so that's why he's a Rebbe and I'm the Rabbi of Hollywood, you know. That's a big deal, right? The pshat is, why do you remember something? I always tell people, we all have photographic memories. We don't bother developing the film. Right? What do you remember? Something you care about. And if you're a Rebbe and you're the Rosh B'nai Yisrael, automatically you have a shaykhus to all Yid. And therefore you remember a voice from 10 years ago, 4 words. Yoel ben Chaya Genendel. From 10 years ago, because that's what you are. You care deeply and passionately about the matzah of every single Jew in the world. And therefore you let you in. You know what I'm saying? Nice. The famous story, there was a guy called Hasofer. Right? What? He's a professor. He was a professor of statistics. And he was an Israeli, and he was brought up in Hashomer HaTzeir. Hashomer HaTzeir is like to the left of Fidel Castro. Right? Religion is the opium of the masses, says Karl Marx. And he knew nothing about religion. Anyway, eventually he moved to Israel. He went to a place called Hobart, Tasmania. You ever heard of Hobart, Tasmania? I once spent Yom Kippur there. I was in Kyle in Melbourne, Australia, and what happened was they needed someone to be the rabbi of the Hobart Hebrew congregation. So me and a friend of mine, Kaczynski, he was the Chazan, I was the rabbi, and we went for Yom Kippur. It's a fascinating place. The shul there was built now it's more than that. And the English, British people, British Empire, they were great people. Like if you were caught stealing a loaf of bread because your 12 kids are starving, they would send you as a convict to Australia. Yeah. So Botany Bay in Sydney, Australia, that was the original. It started off as a penal colony, and one of the places that people were sent was Hobart, Tasmania. Tasmania is a little island separated from the mainland of Australia by the Tasman Sea. And in fact, even today, like 75% of people in Tasmania have Jewish blood in their genes. Because a lot of the convicts were Jewish. You know, some guy in the East End, whatever, sold a loaf of bread. You know? And I saw that just if you know English literature, you ever heard of Oliver Twist? Right? A guy called Charles Dickens? You wouldn't know nothing about these. I'm very impressed.
In Castera, we used to have
in where?
When I was a kid in Castera, we had the library with those books.
I am really.
They had a lot of black lines on the books.
I can imagine. I can't. Okay. Anyway, so in the book, in Oliver Twist, there was a guy called Fagin, who was Jewish.
Yeah, Fagin Machivo.
Yeah, he was the capo there. He was the original Fagin was a Jewish guy, and you could see in Hobart, I saw it, right? The actual prison cell that they kept him in. And they have a shul there that they built in Vienna, and they still have the prayer for Queen Victoria hanging on the wall by the fascinating place, right? Anyway, to cut a long story short, there was years and years ago there were 30 Jewish families in Tasmania. None of them knew Benyaminam Uben Smo. Right? They had a guy who was a shikol Chazan, you know, these Chazan power washers, they do everything, you know, Kol Beinikim, you know, and he was the guy who taught them a bit of whatever Yiddishkeit he knew. Right? And he eventually left. He was a shikol Zika the Yiddishkeit. So meanwhile, this Hasofer guy, right? He was an Israeli, and he lived somewhere around that area in Hobart. So the mishlachet from the Jewish congregation went to him, and they said, "Listen, you have to be our rabbi, our spiritual guide, our chazan, our balkoira, our whatever." He looked at his my entire life. I've never been into a shul. Right? Never been to a shul. They never a mitzvah, knows nothing. But, everything in a land of pygmies is whatever. Normal person is a giant, right? You know how to read Hebrew, because you come from Israel, right? We need you to be the rabbi and the chazan and the balkaira and the whatever. So this guy, like, he's laughing, but but at the end of the day, he knows nothing. But they know less than nothing, And if they don't, so not as a religious, he doesn't believe in anything, but as a humanitarian, as a Jew, a fellow Jew, they shouldn't totally get lost and disappear. He became the Rebbe. Says that the guy doesn't know which way never saw inside of a kitzur shulchan aruch, right? But now he took his responsibility, seriously, right? One day, actually, somebody came to the shul, a guest from somewhere else, and he explained to them that on Ma'ariv you don't make chazoros hashatz. They wouldn't know. Never heard of it. They don't know. They're one of the big amoras than the other, right? So him and his wife realized we got to start learning something. We know nothing. We're the spiritual leaders, so they got whatever. They had the books there. There's nothing there, right? And so they decided they have to become themselves a bit more observant. They have to help, because they're like they started, but they don't know how to become religious. They don't begin from Aleph. No, garbage. The only they know Hebrew, right? They started reading, started learning. One day, right, a guy comes up with a beard and a humble hat, long coat, whatever. And he says, he goes into the shul, and they say, our spiritual leader is Hasofer, right? He goes and meets them, and he said, from now on, anytime you have a problem, you have an issue, he's going to send them Sforim, and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and in English, and whatever, and he's going to train them in basic Judaism, right? They don't know who this guy is, but he looked like a proper rabbi, not like them, right? And eventually, they decided to move to Australia. And their daughter, this Hasofer's daughter, became friendly with the daughter of Rabbi Chaim Gutnik, who's my mechatenist or whatever, right? And she was telling, where do you come from? I come from Tasmania, and before that, right? Oh, my father once went there, and it became, the father was Chaim Gutnik, Rabbi Chaim Gutnik. Why did he come there? Because he received a letter from the Rebbe, and the Rebbe told him he has to do work not only in the community, but in outlying places. And the Rebbe mentioned Hobart, Tasmania, and the Rebbe he went out on a flight, went to Hobart, and this guy became a full-fledged Baal Tshuva. And as they say in Hollywood, the rest is history. How did the Rebbe know there's a guy there in the Shama sitting in Hobart, Tasmania, whatever? Because that's why he's a Rebbe. I can tell you thousands of stories, billions of stories, right? A Rebbe and a Chassid have a connection, and the Rebbe is able to raft and the other, Remendel was in jail. I'll give you an example. Remendel was in jail, and Vahiyah Yoim, the tsaris, the redifis, the persecution was unbearable. It was just, even he couldn't, right? After I led it to the Rebbe. After you write a letter to the Rebbe, you're in a gulag, right? Imagine writing a letter to the Baruch Rebbe, 770 Eastern Parkway. That itself is a hanging offense. In Russia, you write to the Rebbe, you said for somebody to write, give over to the Zaydu, right? It was like anyway, so how does he get? So he can't write a letter. He decided to write a letter mentally in his mind. Right? There was after when the Tzemach Tzedek, after his Rebbe passed away, right? Rebbe Hillel Parcher, I think it was, came to him and says, Rebbe, I need to hear a mimer. By me is Negei Ben Nefesh. So he said, I'm not well, I can't say a mimer. So he said, we have a Kabbalah from the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe means not the Parcher. Alter Rebbe meant the middle Rebbe, right? That a Rebbe could say a mimer b'machshava. So someone thought, okay. He asked for his hat that he wore, but he said Chassidus, and he said Chassidus b'machshava. The Rebbe Marash was standing there, and Rebbe Parcher was standing by the mimer, right? And afterwards, Rebbe Parcher made chazara on the mimer of the Yitzis HaMachshava that the Tzemach Tzedek told. So Rebbes were able to communicate in a different whatever. The pell of the story when the Mendel was in the Gulag and things became unbearable, and he wrote a letter to the Rebbe in Machshava. When in Tovshin Chav Dalet he got out of Russia, and then he came through Harold Wilson to see the Antamaiser, and he met his wife, who he hadn't seen, his family, his son and daughter, he hadn't seen for decades, since before the Tovshin Ches we got out, whatever the years, the Lemberg, Lvov, the brief window that you're able to get out of Russia as a false papers that you're a Polish citizen, and the Mendel also had papers, he gave it away to Nadir. Right? The whole smuggling, the Sarah, the whole business. Right? So when he got out, his wife said, "Taina, how come even in the deepest days, whatever, you managed to write a letter to the Rebbe and you never wrote a letter to me? In all the years, never." He says, "We never wrote a letter to the Rebbe. We got a response, a letter from the Rebbe in response to the letter you wrote me. It came, it arrived in London. He looks at the letter, he looks at the date. That was the day that he wrote the letter b'machshava to the Rebbe. So I'm saying the bond of a chassid and Rebbe is something that. So anyway, getting back to the story, Mendel on this day of Yud Shvat Tovshin Yud, when they told him the previous Rebbe has passed away, he must have been Yiralit because Yud Shvat was a Shabbos, right?
They wouldn't know on Yud Shvat then, yeah.
Yeah, whatever. So, this time he felt it was true, but he didn't want to break in front of the communists. He have to be stark. He went to his bunk where he's staying and he broke down. Whatever. Anyway, he was sitting there with a bunch of prisoners in a gulag, in a concentration camp, in Soviet. And you're dealing here with the lowest dregs of society, but in order to survive, you have to befriend all of them were like Bachas. So what he would do is he would listen to the stories of the inmates and try to think out what could I learn a lesson in Avodas Hashem from the story. These are goyim, Rebbe, whatever. And over the years, I picked up numerous stories I heard from Mendel of lessons that he learned in the gulags from the prison. That day, Punkt Yud Shvat, he hears the guy telling him that in Russia, one of the pastimes is hunting. Hunting is very chosh. My son, Chaim, in the Rebbe, we're looking at a house to buy, renting to him, right? So a house, they had all kinds of bears and what?
I met him 2 weeks ago.
Okay. And all kinds of different, like, whatever, like, you know. They had this mammoth that's extinct, but they found it in the tundra in Siberia. The house was full of all kinds of stuffed animals. They found hunting is a big thing in Russia. So like a certain class of people. And one of the things they always hunt, one of the valuable things, they had bear. The bear is the Russian bear is like the symbol of Russia, right? Problem is the Russian bear in the winter is nothing to eat. So in the summer, in the spring, in the fall, in the autumn, whatever, the bear fressachon, and it gets full of fat and blubber, right? Right? And then it goes into a cave ergets and it hibernates through the difficult years, the difficult cold days of the months of the winter, and then it comes back up, right? Now, the Russian hunter wants to go chop the bear. The problem is the bear is hibernating, right? What does the hunter do? When he goes hunting, he goes with dogs. Dogs have a great sense of smell, a scent, right? And the dog goes into the caves and all these cracks and crevices, whatever, and he finds the bears hibernating, and he starts barking, and he starts growling, and he starts putting his fingernails, and the violet, the bear who's sleeping, right? The bear suddenly like wakes up from his slumber. Is what's going on here? And he sticks his head out of the cave to see if it's tutzach. And the hunter is standing there with his rifle and shoots him between the eyes because you can't get him anywhere else but between the eyes. It just won't penetrate the fat elsewhere, right? And the hunter got him. He got his trophy. And this guy is telling him the story of how they hunt the bears in the winter. And the man is listening and said, "What in the world does this got to do with what's the lesson of Hashem?" So he came out to America the first time. Yes, verstehe ich, Yud Shvat, the day the Rebbe is in the Kabbalah Messias, or became Rebbe, now it's in the Moshe. So the American Jew is like the fat Russian bear. Yishman Yeshur and Vayiva, right? It's Festachon, and it goes hibernating somewhere in Alish Yorn, in all 50 states of America, and all these crazy places. And the hunter is a Rebbe, and the Rebbe wants to chap this back to Karchevse. Only problem is that the Rebbe can't be in 300 different billion places at the same time. So what does the Rebbe do? The Rebbe sends little hints, little dogs. Are you Jewish? You want to put on tefillin? You want to mezuzah? You want to... All right? And they sort of wake up this big, fat, hibernating bear. And once you get, then you're ready, you got the hunter will get you. Yeah. What's the moral of the story? What the moral of the story is, if you're a shliach, right, the first thing is you have to realize, whatever you are, right, you are nothing more than the little dog. You think you're a great speaker, and you're Zachsi Nashid, and you're Bal Madrega, and you're learned and educated and sophisticated, and you have such a wonderful, winning, charismatic personality, and therefore you're able to have all this great success. The emphasis is it's all coming from the Rebbe. Right? You're just a little hund who sent out to wake people up. Right? And this is connected to a pasuk in last week's parasha. This week, our whole arichah is like last 2 weeks in Mishmashir. It says, "V'amata hazeh tikach b'yodecha shetasa b'yozois." A yid has to realize that you're nothing more than what? A mata. You're a tickle holz. You're a klutz, right? You're a piece of a stick, right? You're no good klutz. When you take a piece of whatever and you invest in it, the Abisha puts koiches in it, then you have koiches. And there's nothing you can do once you're nothing more than a mata again. And this is not only true vis-a-vis the chassid is related to the Rebbe, it's true with the Rebbe also. Right? Let me try to explain this, what I'm talking about. I'll tell you a story. I don't think you'll appreciate the story. It's one of the deepest stories I know. It's a simple story. You got to understand it. The Yid I know his name was Nachman Yosef Twersky. I just was sitting with Shiva Rachman in New York. Came to the Shiva twice, whatever. He's a very nice person. His father was the old Rachman Shifka Rebbe. His brother is now the Rachman Shifka Rebbe in Yerushalayim. Right? When he became a Lubavitcher, there was murders going on in the Polish world. They were all like a crazy square up. This one, like a Lubavitcher, like a whole Polish Lubavitcher with a Streimel Shabbos. They gave him a full-fledged Lubavitcher. Right? Cut a long story short. When he got married, he married the daughter of Ramesh Ashkenazi. He married the sister of Moti Ashkenazi from Drachabad. Right? The wedding was in 770. So his father, who was the Shifka Rebbe, came for the Chazan. Right? I knew that I was once by the Tish of the Shifka Rebbe, the old one. Right? He had piercing eyes. You know, eyes that you feel penetrating eyes. He was a very special person. Anyway, he came to the Chasana, and whatever day of the Chasana, he davened Mincha in 7-7, the Rebbe's Mincha. The Rebbe walks in, davened Mincha, and walked out. Hello? By the way, I'm telling you, when the Rebbe davened Mincha, an ordinary thing, if you're a simple guy, there's none of this by the Polish Rebbe's Meglatz with the Uygin, and they make things, and there's Kilus and Takas and whatever. No. Actually, a classical story. When the Rebbe first became Rebbe, there was a Satmar guy, who lived in Williamsburg, and he had a Lubavitcher relish, and those days everyone got on well, like it was very nice for everyone, the Achdus in those days. And he spent Shabbos in the Kranite, right? And by Lubavitcher relations, and they took him to 770, the Rebbe's Minyan. The Rebbe walks in, stood by his place, no great snuas, no great shaking, no great clapping, no great hacking, no nothing. Right? So after that, the Rebbe walked in, the Rebbe walked out, you could see nothing, right? The Rebbe stood there like whatever. He never actually knew when the Rebbe was davening, when there was not davening, another whole shmooze himself, right? Whatever. And he walks out, and the Lubavitcher relation by the Sunnah, what do you think about a new Rebbe? A Satmar guy, no Streimel, no Struckers, no this, no that, just very like whatever. He didn't want to be offensive. In those days, people still had midas, you know. Very nice, very nice. That night, went to bed. And he had a dream. He's walking down Eastern Parkway, and he meets the Lubavitcher Rebbe coming the other way. And the Rebbe stops him and bends down and whispers in his ear, "Al tigu b'mashiach, chepes of mission." He says, "Al tigu, do not attack, do not whatever the anointed ones, right? Don't mess. Al chepes of mission. Don't. He was trying to be nice, but he was like, he saw nothing with it. He had this dream. He thought maybe it's just like a figment of his imagination. What you think by day, you dream by night, whatever. But maybe there is something with this new Rebbe. I didn't pick up. He decided to go closer. And by the Rebbe's davening, he'd be able to see him face to face, like whatever. Stand by the Anakodesh. Anyway, that morning, the Rebbe comes in on time, goes straight to his place, and the Rebbe sees this Satmar guy. Before he goes to his place, he bends down to him and says, "Chaloimos shov yidaber." Chaloimos shov yidaber. Never trust dreams. He went back to his place. Wow. He like sort of. Anyway, I was like, so, but superficially, so no, it was already like stayed, no superficial. The Rachman Shifka Rebbe, after Dika, he turned to his son Nachman Yosef, the Chazan. People say Lubavitch are experts at propaganda. They know PR. That's why they're successful, because they're, know how to sell the movement, sell whatever. It says Be'emes Lubavitch, the propaganda is a churban. If Lubavitch would be able to publicize how the Rebbe walks into Mincha, they would conquer the world. What's pshat in the story? What do you mean? Right? You want to speak the godless of our Rebbe. He knows Kol Terkula. He knows Shas, Pavli, Yushalmi, Sefros, and Ritas, after the Chilta, Kol Terkula, Rifra, Shad, Balpeh. Great. You can speak about the Rebbe as a great tzaddik, Gamal Roch HaKodesh. That doesn't grab, that doesn't have what a Rebbe really is. The way, and I can't explain to anyone who never saw it, it's very hard. The way the Rebbe would come into an ordinary mincha on a Wednesday, like nothing's happening, right? The complete, utter bittul to the Rasul Elyon, that's what Rebbe is. Not something, that complete, utter self-nullification. To do in your whole Metzias, Ramachi, Vorim, Shaginam, is to do what the Eibishter wants. That's like the holiest of Madrigas are higher than anything else in the world. Right?
That or Rabbi Kofel is touch on that.
What are you saying? Let me hear.
It's same.
Same the
You know what I'm saying, yeah? We're listening.
It says in Pasuk, Pari says to Moshe Rabbeinu,
Just
who's talking here?
Dobby.
Okay, fine. The point is, right? It says Tzlu lachem oifis. Right? Tzlu lachem oifis. Lachem. I'll tell you just one story. I'll finish off with the story. Then go to the Lubavitch actually. There's a vort from Tfer Shlomo. Right? There was once a story of if you know history of Jews in Poland, right? There was Poland was conquered by the Russians. So the Russians ran Poland. Then in the 18-something or others, the Polish patriots, the nationalists, made a revolution against Russian rule. Right? And for a time they were winning the battle. Meanwhile, there was a Yid who lived in Poland, western part of Poland, and what's it called again? He is a Gvir, a multimillionaire, and they wanted, the Polish nationalists, the patriots wanted him to give a lot of money to support food for the rebels who were rebelling against the Russian overlords. He didn't want to give money. He wasn't very high in his charity priorities, right? Refused. They took him, they grabbed him hostage, they judged him at a court-martial, and they passed him he's going to be hung on a lamppost. The family here, they're going to kill him. They ran to the Tfer Shlomo in Radomsk, asked Radomsk Rebbe to intercede with heaven. Radomsk Rebbe said, don't worry about it. He laughed it off. Then trust me, they're not going to hang him. What you have to do is you have to speak to the head of the rebels, right? He will accept you, right? And instead he'll give you a financial payment and you'll ransom your father. That's it. They walk in, he's makabel them b'sever pon yofis. Okay, we're not going to hang them, but for the crime of not supporting the nationalist side in the revolution, you have to pay 30,000 rubles. Fortune of money, but and they paid it and finished. They went back to the Radomsk Rebbe to tell him, Baruch Hashem, he's saved. You heard what happened? 30,000 rubles of fortune of money. It's not fair. Because I promise you, every penny you gave, every ruble will be returned to you. That was as likely as someone parachuting in from Pluto with the Rebbe. But the Rebbe hastened. And what happens is the Russians then gained the upper hand. And they executed in the most cruelest, heinous way all the revolutionaries. They just dismembered them. And all the things that they had taken from people, chafetzim, whatever, were kept in aware, and they gave it back. They see a thing, 30,000 ruble in Mizuman, with a note, we took this from the Jew, right? And the general gave it back to the family, and the guy, which is a pili ploy. They could have taken it for the Tsar's coffers, they could have pocketed it. They gave it back. Very rare to give it back to a Jew. His family was so they went back to the Tfer Shlomo, told him the good news. As predicted, everything is like, Tfer Shlomo comes screaming at them. Get out of here, beat it, scram. I don't want to hear about this crazy voice. Get lost, beat it. So there was a Talmud of the Radomsk, a very close person. He saw this whole exchange, and when the people left, the Radomsk was like the Tfer Shlomo was fired. He said, Rebbe, what did they do so bad? Why they, at the end of the day, people see Ruach HaKodesh and Moifsim from Sadiqim, it strengthened them. Why was he so like Varfin of the Moifsim? So the first time says, a good question, a good point. I'll tell you a story. The Baal Shem Tov once called in his great Talmud, Rebbe Lotcher, who was Kodesh HaKadosh. Rebbe Lotcher was living in penury and poverty. His family was starving, whatever. He was offered a Choshev Sheiner Abonus in a big, prestigious position. And then they knew he's a tzaddik, he's a malach, he had no time for whatever. All of the rubbish in the job of a rabbi, right? So they got someone else, some unbeliever to do it. He could sit there just shining like an angel. He could sit there all terrible of it. And Michal wanted to refuse the job, the position. Hashem said, Chas v'sholem, you could sit there al Torah v'al avoda, your family could be supported, you must take this job. And you have the koiches min Hashemayim, you're a this, you're a tzaddik, you're this, you have the koiches to do. No, I'm not fit. Finally, the Hashem says, you have the ability to sit there in peace and menucha, serenity, tranquility, al Torah v'al avoda. If you don't take this position, is a charai, you don't care about Torah. You're not chashav Torah. Right? I'm telling you, if you don't take this job, if you'll do uprising, I'll rip you out of Eilam Hazeh, I'll rip you out of Eilam Haba. The Nechudotcher was Mekusher to his Rebbe. He said, Rebbe, I'm willing to give up my Eilam Hazeh, I'm willing to give up my Eilam Haba, but I can't take a position that I'm unsuitable for. It's not my Teresh and Neshama. The hears that, he smiles. He was brought down in Teresh Leim in Parashat Dvarim. And he said, I was just testing you. Baruch Atah, Baruch Taimach, right? How do you get a lichgarid, right? He says, ordinary people have nisyonis of God knows what, right? What does tzaddikim have nisyonis? The Chap Madrigas. The Abraham says, I'll stuff you with Ruach HaKodesh. I'll give you clairvoyant prophetic powers. I'll give you the ability to make mufsim, whatever. But your head will swell. Right? And that is the nisoyin of a tzaddik. Will you not? That's why Tnu Lochem Moifis, right? Right? I'm going to give you a mata, right? And this mata you could do whatever. Let's see if you're able to use it properly, or you misuse it. And an emes tzaddik, all the krichas that's given to Milmaila is only used to fulfill the Ratzon Hashem. And we are also a shtickle mata, we're little dogs, right? We also have to learn from this lesson. Our ikr in life is not you, not Begashmi, is not Beruchni, not in this world, not in Elam Haba, right? You know there's a Gemara Chulin, by a goy, first you have day, and then you have night. Right? The night comes after the day. By Yid, Hayim Hadach HaLayl, right? First you have night, and then you have day. By Kotchim, is Halayla HaHarim. The Sefer in Teres Moshe explains why. A goy, in this world, the sun is shining on him. It's all great. If at Town 99 you go to McDonald's, you have a cheeseburger with fries and mac and a big milkshake, great. Everywhere in the world you got a McDonald's, it's no problems. Right? But first comes the day, and then comes the night. Then you have the Roy and Oila and whatever. A Yid has all the trials and tribulations and sorrows. First you have night, and then you have the day. Ultimately, in the next world, it's good. But by Kochim, by a tzaddik, right? He's not interested in Eilam Haba. Right? He's interested in doing the Ratzon HaBoyer. And where do you do Torah mitzvahs? The Mason Chafi, when you're alive in this world. Right? By Kochim, the Lailas are the Chachayim. Eilam Haba with Gan Eden, Gan Eden, Gan Atam, it's all Laila. For him, day is what? Here and now. L'chaim, l'chaim.
Yossi helping up and say it's coming in, yours coming in.
You got a car,
How'd you get it?
My wife brought me.